Before they were dethroned by the Stormcast, the warrior priests of Sigmar used to be the icon of Warhammer Fantasy. Today, it's time to combine the two. In a previous video, I experimented with creating more grimdark Stormcast liberators. One of them had a warrior priest look to him, and I was curious to see if I could push that aesthetic further and make a full-on hybrid of a Stormcast and warrior priest of Sigmar. As a base, I'm using the easy build trio of Sequitors. They're already robed and have some truly badass poses. I started by cracking the Stormcast apart, then snipping him in two again at the waist. I loathe Stormcast pauldrons, and so I took Glean snipping his away. His front I didn't reattach, and instead glued the upper portion of a Tartarus Terminator to serve as an armored collar. At the waist, I glued in a plasticard sheet, then glued the torso to it, careful to make sure it was at the same angle as the original pose. I used globs of Procreate to stabilize the joint, then used green stuff to sculpt in the breastplate beneath. Over that, I sculpted another armor belly thing with layered hip armor. I also sculpted pauldrons in imitation of those on the warrior priest. I ended up re-sculpting the bottom half of the breastplate several times, and was happy with none of them. There was just something odd about his proportions each time. I decided to stop trying to reinvent the Stormcast wheel and instead install this breastplate from the Blight King's kit, which is roughly the correct size. It did need some modifications though. I sliced off the armored skirt portion, careful to leave it intact so I could attach it later. I also sliced off the upper third of the breastplate so it would fit beneath the existing iron collar. I glued the breastplate in place, then the armored skirt beneath it. Though I don't show it here, I scraped down the breastplate quite a lot so it had a slimmer and less potbelly silhouette. I wanted him to look chonky, but not actually chunky, which was a hard line to hit. With his basic armor worked out, it was time to pimp it out with some Sigmarite flavor. First up, I replaced his pauldron with one from the Blight King's kit. The skull would be better if it was wreathed like other Imperial sigils, but still worked better than a blank pauldron. The true sigil of a warrior priest of Sigmar is the twin-tailed comet though. This particular one comes from one of the Free Guild kits, though I forget which. I carefully bent it, then glued it to the left pauldron. It's a minor touch, but one that really helps sell him as a warrior priest. Another twin-tailed item of insignia is the shield from another Free Guild kit. Carefully snipped down the parchment from the end of it, cleaned up the cut, and glued the shield to his hip as an oversized tassel. The parchment I'd cut off wasn't quite long enough to use on its own, so I glued it beneath the opposite hip plate to look like it was being lifted in the wind. Warrior priests usually have way more parchment hanging from them, but I didn't have access to any, and honestly, I don't really think he needed any more to sell him as a warrior priest. I'd added an armor plate to the back of my warrior priest, but didn't quite like how it looked, so I covered it with a shield slung across it, though I later changed it to a slightly smaller one. I'd long ago snipped off the original Stormcast hammer because it was endlessly lame, and to replace it, I had a few options. The first was this hammer from the Stardrake kit. It's quite badass, and the back of the hammer, if you squint at it, looks like a stylized comet tail, but it didn't feel quite grim enough for a warrior priest. The second option was this upsized axe and hammer combo. Even cutting off the axe portion though, the size wasn't quite right. The third option was this power hammer from the 40k Deathwatch kit. It's far less common to de-techify 40k bits to use in Warhammer Fantasy than techify fantasy ones to use in 40k, but I liked the gothic feel of the hammer, something sarcophagus-like about the indented heads. I snipped the head of the hammer, then sliced off the inquisitorial sigil. I pinned the hammer to its haft and fitted the arms to my warrior priest to make sure it looked good. Warrior priests often have chunky leather gauntlets, but I don't really like them, so I decided to replace his with metal. I sliced down the gauntlets and glued in place the one on the left. One side effect of all my tinkering was that the haft of the hammer had gotten pushed forward a bit, which left a gap in the arms. This isn't really visible enough to be worth reconfiguring the arms entirely though, so I simply used Procreate to extend the upper arm of the left arm, and did the same to the forearm of the right, hiding my crimes with another metal gauntlet. One common aspect of warrior priests is to have half tabards of chainmail. I'm not the best at sculpting chainmail. I usually just use bits from the Blight King's kit when I need some, but in this case I didn't have any chainmail that would match the windswept angle of his robes. I smoothed green stuff over the front panel of his robes, then poked ascending and descending rows of holes in it. This didn't end up looking great, but it could also be painted to look like studded leather or brigandine. For heads, I originally thought about using the same one I had in the Stormcast conversion I showed at the beginning, but instead decided to go with one of the Space Wolves Scout kit. It originally comes with a mic headset, but I carefully sliced those portions away. I love the grim and solemn energy it gives him, a true warrior priest of Sigmar. Easily the coolest female Stormcast model Games Workshop has ever made is this one. She has a great pose and grit, and her head is probably the best female head, not just among the Stormcast, but in all of Games Workshop's range. There was no way I wasn't going to convert her into a warrior priest. I actually have no idea if female warrior priests are canon, but I also don't super care. I started by snapping off her front and carving off the front of her robes. Stormcast exhibit a bizarre amount of sexual dimorphism in size and build, but I thought the same Stormcast collar that had worked for my previous warrior priest might still work here. I snipped it down and used a glob of Procreate to attach it in place. Once it was in place, I immediately saw it wouldn't work though, and so I replaced it with the collar from a chest plate from the Deathwatch kit. It's ever so slightly smaller in circumference, which worked better with her build, and below it I sculpted the same kind of belly armor I had for my first warrior priest. It actually worked a lot better here though, and I was happy enough with it to leave it since I knew it would be covered with what I had in mind next. I'd been a little wary of cutting down her pauldron because of how the haft of her hammer rests against it, but I really do hate it, so I snipped and sliced it carefully. Instead of sculpting a new pauldron over it, I instead looped some green stuff and started sculpting the top of a cloak. Sigmar warrior priests often have some kind of a poncho type cloak thing, and from the beginning I thought it would be necessary to hide any awkwardness between collar and breastplate. It didn't end up terrible, and I did iterate on it again from what you see here, but ultimately the cloak just kept feeling like a really grandmotherly element, and I also realized that there actually wasn't that much awkwardness to hide, so I ended up ditching it after I worked on her shield arm. Speaking of, for the shield arm I snipped down the gauntlet, and like with my first priest, replaced it with a metal one. For the shield itself though, I had more extensive plans. I sliced down the hammer and anvil from the shield, careful to keep the curve beneath smooth. This is one of the flails from the Flagellant kit. It doesn't look great, but it does have a nifty twin-tailed comet sigil in it. I cut it off from the rest of the flail, then carved down the back of it till it was half the height. I then glued it to the empty portion of the shield. I don't actually know if warrior priests use shields in lore, but it looked cool, and so I don't really care. Back to the main body of the Stormcast, I'd taken off the poncho and replaced it with another sculpted pauldron. I also carved off the drape of her robe at the front that's usually there. While I quite like it as a touch, I wanted to replace it as I had with my previous Stormcast with a chainmail one. Before that though, I wanted to add a warrior priest element that I hadn't been able to incorporate into my first Stormcast, and that was a tome hanging at her waist. They're completely impractical and also completely awesome. There's actually a really perfectly sized one emblazoned with a comet from the Flagellants kit, but I don't have access to it, so instead I'm making do with this one from some Inquisition type kit. To make room for it, I carved off one of the tassets I'd sculpted and a good bit of her leg. It's a bit of a cheat to have elements clipped through each other like that, but once glued in place the book looked pretty good. Later I'd use green stuff to connect it with a strap to her belly plate. It was time to arm my Sig Priest. I had a few options. The first was this Chaos Warrior hammer, which is actually not that far off from the one priests of Sigmar usually use, but I felt looked a little cartoonish. This is some Stormcast hammer that if I snipped the axe blade from on the back would have looked like a pretty perfect melding of Sig Priest and Stormcast aesthetic. It was a touch too big though, and honestly I had a final option that I liked more. This is the battle pick from some Dark Angel Space Marine kit. It has a really gothic, dark age medieval feel to it, and I felt like was pretty perfect besides the tech bits. Those in the Marine's hands were easy to carve off, and I pinned the haft to my Stormcast's hand. Finally, I sculpted in a chainmail haft tabard. Like with my last priest, it isn't great, but serves well enough. I also gave her one of the tourney shields from the Demigryph kit with a flaming comet. It makes her silhouette a little busier, but also helps hide the issue that from a certain angle her torso was looking a little long. And with that, my Storm Priests were completed. In all, I'm really pleased with them and think they do a decent job of channeling that old world warrior priest energy. The one warrior priest element I wasn't really able to incorporate was the pages that the priests pinned to themselves, but I didn't have access to any that didn't just make either model look busy and cluttered, so those will have to wait till next time. What do you think about them? What other kind of Stormcast conversions would you like to see? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.